The Final Sacrifice, Unveiling the Dark Truth Behind the Fog. Chapter 1. Return to the Unknown. The hum of the car engine was the only sound in the stillness of the early morning as Ethan Carter drove down the desolate highway. His eyes, heavy with exhaustion from the sleepless nights that had plagued him since receiving the cryptic message, scanned the road ahead. The trees lining either side of the road seemed to loom closer with every mile, their bare branches clawing at the sky like desperate fingers trying to escape something unseen. The isolation of his hometown had always felt like a comforting cocoon in his childhood, but now, returning after so many years, it felt more like a trap waiting to spring. The message had come without warning, a vague, almost incoherent plea for help from an old friend he hadn't spoken to in over a decade. The fog is back. People are gone, Ethan. You need to come. You need to see for yourself. There was no signature, but Ethan had recognized the handwriting immediately. Mason Holt, the town sheriff, a man who was once like a brother to him. They had been inseparable as kids, but life had pulled them in different directions, with Ethan leaving for the city to chase stories while Mason stayed behind, burying himself in the rhythms of small-town law enforcement. Why Mason had reached out after all this time was a question that gnawed at him. Something terrible was happening, and whatever it was, it had drawn Ethan back. As the road curved, a heavy mist began to creep across the asphalt, swirling like tendrils of smoke. The fog. It was thicker here, almost unnaturally so, curling and twisting like it had a mind of its own. Ethan slowed the car to a crawl, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. The message had spoken of a fog, but nothing had prepared him for this. It wasn't just a natural occurrence. There was something eerie about the way it moved, as if it was alive, watching, waiting. By the time he reached the outskirts of the town, the mist had completely enveloped the landscape, shrouding the familiar landmarks in an oppressive gray blanket. The once bustling streets were now ghostly quiet, devoid of the usual life and energy. Storefronts were boarded up, homes were locked tight, and there wasn't a single person in sight. It was as if the town had collectively held its breath, waiting for the worst to happen. Ethan parked his car outside the old diner, its neon sign flickering weakly in the mist. He stepped out, the cold dampness of the fog clinging to his skin like icy fingers. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and he could feel a weight pressing down on him, a heavy silence that made his every step feel deliberate, as if the ground itself was listening. He glanced around, half expecting anyone to appear, but the streets remained eerily empty. As he approached the diner, the door swung open before he could reach for it. Mason Holt stood in the doorway, his figure barely visible in the dim light. Time had not been kind to Mason. His once broad shoulders seemed to have slumped under the weight of whatever burden he was carrying, and the lines on his face were deeper, etched by years of worry and fatigue. His eyes, though, were still the same, sharp, wary, and full of suspicion. "You actually came," Mason said, his voice rough and tired. He stepped aside, gesturing for Ethan to enter. "Wasn't sure you'd want to come back." Ethan walked inside, his boots echoing off the tiled floor. The diner was deserted, save for a single waitress who sat in the corner, her eyes fixed on the window, staring into the mist as if waiting for something to emerge from it. "What's going on here, Mason?" Ethan asked, sliding into a booth. He didn't bother with pleasantries. There was no time for them now. Mason sat across from him, folding his hands on the table. "People are disappearing," he said bluntly. "It started about a month ago. First, it was just a couple of hikers who went missing in the woods. Then, more people started vanishing. No bodies, no clues, just gone." "And the fog?" Ethan pressed, glancing out the window at the swirling mass outside. Mason nodded, his face grim. "The fog showed up around the same time. It's different. Moves like it's alive. We've tried to investigate, but every time we get close, it's like it pushes us back. People are scared, Ethan. Hell, I'm scared." Ethan leaned back in his seat, processing what Mason had told him. Disappearances, an unnatural fog, and a town too afraid to leave their homes. It sounded like the plot of one of the horror stories he used to cover as a young journalist. But this was different. This was personal. "Where's Sarah?" Ethan asked, realizing he hadn't seen or heard anything about her since he arrived. Mason's expression softened for a moment. She's leading the search and rescue. She's been out there every day trying to find the missing people. It's taking a toll on her, but you know Sarah, she won't stop until she finds something." Ethan nodded. Sarah Whitmore had always been relentless, even when they were younger. She was the kind of person who would run toward danger when everyone else ran the other way. The thought of her out there in the fog made his stomach twist with unease. "I need to talk to her," Ethan said, standing up. "Where can I find her?" Before Mason could answer, the door to the diner creaked open again. Ethan turned to see Sarah stepping inside, her face drawn and pale. She was drenched in mist, her clothes clinging to her as if she had just walked through a storm. But it wasn't the cold that had drained the color from her cheeks. It was something else, something far more sinister. "I saw it," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "In the fog, there was something watching me." Ethan felt a chill crawl down his spine. He had sensed it too, that feeling of being observed, but he had pushed it aside, convincing himself it was just his imagination. But now, hearing it from Sarah, he knew it was real. Something was out there, lurking in the fog, and it wasn't going to stop. Before he could speak, the door behind them slammed shut with a force that rattled the windows. The waitress in the corner let out a startled gasp, her eyes widening in terror. Ethan turned, his heart racing as he caught a glimpse of a shadow moving outside the window, a dark figure barely visible through the swirling mist. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The shadow paused, lingering just beyond the glass, its shape indistinct but undeniably humanoid. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he realized it wasn't just standing there, it was watching him, waiting. "Do you see it?" Sarah's voice broke the silence, her hand gripping Ethan's arm tightly. "I see it," he whispered, his eyes locked on the figure. "But what the hell is it?" Before anyone could answer, the shadow melted back into the fog, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. The diner fell into an oppressive silence once more, but the tension in the air remained, heavy and unrelenting. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he turned back to Mason and Sarah. Whatever this fog was, whatever that shadow had been, it was only the beginning. Something dark and terrible was lurking in this town, and it had already begun to close in on them. As they stood there, trying to make sense of what they had just seen, a soft voice broke the quiet. "Daddy?" "I can hear the fog." Ethan spun around, his eyes wide with shock. There, standing at the edge of the booth, was his daughter, Olivia, her small frame barely visible in the dim light. Her eyes were wide and unblinking as she stared out the window, her voice barely more than a whisper. "The fog," she repeated, her voice trembling. "It's talking to me." Ethan's blood ran cold. This wasn't just a strange weather phenomenon. This was something far worse, something ancient and malevolent, and now it had his daughter in its sights. Chapter 2: Whispers in the Mist. The fog had thickened overnight, transforming the town into a suffocating labyrinth of gray. By morning, it was so dense that Ethan could hardly see past the porch of the motel where he was staying. The sense of dread that had crept over the town in recent days now hung heavy in the air, infecting everyone who remained. As Ethan stepped outside, the silence was unsettling. No sounds of morning traffic, no voices from the few remaining residents. It was as if the fog had swallowed everything. Inside, Olivia was still asleep, her small body curled tightly under the thin blanket. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in his chest since last night, when she had whispered about hearing the fog speak. He knew children had active imaginations, but there had been something in her voice, something that made him believe this wasn't just a product of a bad dream. He quietly closed the door behind him, walking down the narrow path that led toward the sheriff's office. The roads, now empty of life, looked unfamiliar to him. The town he had once known had changed, but not just in appearance. There was a palpable fear in the air, one that was growing stronger with each passing hour. The fog had claimed more than just the missing. It had stolen the town's hope. As Ethan reached the sheriff's office, Mason was waiting for him on the steps. His face, lined with exhaustion, told Ethan that the situation had only worsened since last night. "People are losing it," Mason said without preamble. "I've had 2 more families leave town this morning. Those who stay, they're too scared to even step outside. And with more folks vanishing." Ethan nodded grimly. How many are missing now? 23, Mason replied, his voice heavy. 2 more disappeared last night, a father and his son. They went out to search for the boy's mother, who had gone missing the day before. They never came back. Any leads? Anything at all? Ethan asked, though he already knew the answer. The fog left no clues, no footprints, no evidence, just an overwhelming sense of helplessness. Mason shook his head. Nothing. The fog swallows them whole. Ethan's jaw tightened. He felt the familiar pull of frustration that he often experienced when chasing a story with no leads. But this wasn't just another investigation. This was personal. His own daughter had been touched by whatever malevolent force was at play, and the idea that she could be next terrified him more than he cared to admit. "I'm heading out to search again today," Mason continued, running a hand through his thinning hair. "But I need you to come with me. People are talking, Ethan. They're saying the fog is cursed, that it's not just some natural phenomenon. They think it's alive." "Alive?" Ethan repeated, raising an eyebrow. "You don't actually believe that, do you?" Mason didn't answer right away. He glanced out at the swirling mist that seemed to press against the windows of the sheriff's office, as if listening. "I don't know what to believe anymore," he admitted. "But whatever's out there, it's not normal." Just then, the door behind them creaked open, and Sarah stepped out, her face as grim as the rest of the town. She had dark circles under her eyes, a testament to sleepless nights spent searching for the missing. "We're running out of time," she said without greeting. "The fog's closing in faster, and people are too scared to keep searching. But I won't give up. We can't." Ethan admired her determination, but he could see the toll it was taking on her. She had always been strong, but this was wearing her down in a way he had never seen before. And yet she pressed on because there was no other option. "I'll go with you," Ethan said. "We need answers, and we're not going to get them sitting around, waiting for more people to disappear." The 3 of them set out later that morning, trudging through the streets that had once been vibrant with life, but now resembled a ghost town. The fog was thick enough to cut through, swirling ominously around them as they ventured toward the outskirts of town, where most of the disappearances had occurred. As they walked, a strange sense of unease settled over Ethan. The fog moved strangely here, not like normal mist that drifted lazily in the wind, but with purpose. It curled and twisted, almost as if it were alive, watching, waiting. Ethan tried to shake off the feeling, but the further they went, the more oppressive the fog became, like a living entity bearing down on them. Sarah suddenly paused, holding up a hand to stop them. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. Ethan strained to listen. At first, there was nothing but the soft rustling of the wind through the trees. But then, faintly, he heard it, a voice. It was distant, muffled, almost like a whisper carried on the wind. He couldn't make out the words, but the sound sent a chill down his spine. "We need to keep moving," Mason said, though his voice was tinged with unease. As they pushed further into the fog, the voices grew louder. They seemed to come from all directions, echoing through the mist like disembodied spirits. Ethan's heart raced. The whispers weren't random, they were calling their names. "Ethan," a voice said softly, almost too quiet to hear. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. The sound had been so clear, so personal. He turned, but saw nothing behind him except the swirling fog. His mind raced. Was it his imagination? Or was something, or someone actually out there? "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice low. Sarah and Mason exchanged uneasy glances. "We all heard it," Sarah whispered. Before they could react, a shadow moved in the fog just ahead of them. It was quick, darting between the trees, barely more than a flicker in the corner of their eyes, but unmistakably human-shaped. "Did you see that?" Mason hissed, gripping the flashlight in his hand as if it were a weapon. Ethan nodded, his pulse quickening. They had seen shadows in the mist before, but never this close. And there was something different about this one. Something deliberate. It wasn't just passing through, it was watching. Without another word, they pressed on, their movements slow and cautious. Every so often, another whisper would cut through the silence, sending shivers down Ethan's spine. The voices weren't random, they were purposeful, taunting, as if something was trying to lure them deeper into the fog. At last, they reached the spot where the father and son had last been seen. The area was eerily quiet, save for the ever-present whispers, The ground was undisturbed, no footprints, no signs of a struggle. It was as if the two had simply vanished into thin air. As they scanned the area, Ethan's thoughts drifted back to Olivia. She had been acting strange ever since they arrived in town. Her nightmares had grown more frequent, her sleep more restless. Last night, she had spoken in her sleep, muttering about figures in the fog, about voices that called to her. He had chalked it up to the stress of their return, but now, standing here in the thick of the mist, he wasn't so sure. What if there was more to it? What if Olivia's connection to the fog was real? His thoughts were interrupted by Sarah's sharp intake of breath. She had found something. Drawings, crude and childlike, etched into the dirt near the base of a tree. They were strange, almost primitive, depicting twisted figures standing in the fog, and beneath them, a single word scratched hastily into the earth. Help. Before Ethan could process what they were seeing, a chilling realization hit him. Olivia. He had left her alone at the motel, trusting that the fog wouldn't come that far. But the voices, the whispers, what if they were calling to her? His heart pounded as he stood, his mind racing. He needed to get back, now. And then, as if on cue, the fog swirled around them, thickening like a living wall. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as a distant sound reached his ears, a voice clear this time and unmistakable. Daddy, it was Olivia. Without another word, Ethan took off running, the fog closing in behind him as he raced toward the motel. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and the shadowy figures danced at the edges of his vision. And then he saw it. The motel, barely visible through the haze. But Olivia was gone. The door was wide open and her small footprints led straight into the mist. Chapter 3. Lost in the Shadows. The fog was now more than a suffocating presence. It had become a predator, tightening its grip on the town with each passing moment. What little light pierced through the mist barely revealed more than a few feet ahead, casting strange, twisting shadows that seemed to follow every step. Ethan's heart hammered in his chest as he raced back toward the motel, dread building with every stride. Olivia's footprints led into the fog, vanishing into the thick blanket of mist that swallowed the streets. By the time Sarah and Mason caught up to him, Ethan had already reached the edge of town, where the motel had stood. Now it was barely visible, an indistinct shape swallowed by the encroaching fog. The door still hung open, Olivia's small shoes abandoned just inside the threshold. It was as if she had been drawn away by invisible hands. She can't have gone far, Sarah murmured, though her voice betrayed the same worry that Ethan felt. We'll find her. Mason, gun in hand, scanned the surrounding area. But in this, it's almost impossible to track anything in this mess. Ethan swallowed hard, the knot in his stomach tightening. His thoughts raced back to the voices, the ones that had called his name. He had heard them as clearly as his own thoughts. And now, Olivia was gone, pulled into the fog that seemed to be growing with every passing second. We need to split up, Ethan said, his voice hoarse with urgency. We can cover more ground that way. We don't have time. Sarah shook her head. No, we stay together. We don't know what's out there. For a moment, Ethan was tempted to argue, but the fog had a way of twisting everything. Their senses, their judgment. It was like a living force, manipulating their perception. He couldn't afford to lose control. Not now. Not with Olivia out there. All right, he conceded, but we need to start looking. Now. They moved as one, venturing deeper into the town. The once familiar streets were unrecognizable, swallowed by the eerie grayness that clung to everything. The wind stirred, carrying with it the same faint whispers they had heard before. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The voices were back, distant but insistent, like a forgotten memory trying to resurface. As they passed through the town square, Sarah paused, her gaze fixed on the old library. There might be something in there, she said quietly. If this fog isn't new, maybe there are records. Clues. Mason raised an eyebrow. You really think a book is going to help us right now? We don't have any other leads, Sarah replied, already heading toward the building. Ethan followed, his mind racing. The library was one of the oldest buildings in town, built long before he was born. If there was anything strange in the town's past, it would be buried there, among the dust-covered shelves and forgotten tomes. The heavy wooden doors groaned as they pushed them open. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with the scent of aged paper and neglect. The fog hadn't penetrated the interior, but its oppressive presence seemed to linger just outside, as if waiting for them to step back into its embrace. Sarah wasted no time, heading straight for the back of the library, where the town's historical archives were stored. Ethan and Mason followed closely, their eyes scanning the rows of shelves lined with old records and journals. After what felt like hours of searching, Sarah pulled a crumbling, leather-bound journal from a hidden corner. The cover was worn and faded, its edges yellowed with age. She blew off the layer of dust and carefully opened it, her eyes scanning the pages. "Here," she said, pointing to a passage written in a spidery hand. "Listen to this. The mist comes in waves with whispers that call to the lost. We have tried to ward it off with fire and prayer, but the fog is not of this world. It feeds on those who enter willingly and punishes those who resist. The elders know of the ritual, but it is forbidden to speak of it." Ethan's blood ran cold. "What ritual?" Sarah shook her head, flipping through more pages. "There's nothing specific about the ritual, but it seems the fog has been here before. Decades ago, maybe even longer." "So, this has happened before," Mason said grimly, his face darkening. "And no one said a word?" Sarah kept reading. "It's all vague, but it sounds like there was some sort of offering made to keep the fog at bay. But something went wrong. There were disappearances, just like now. They tried to cover it up, bury it in history." "Why didn't anyone remember this?" Ethan asked, his voice taut with frustration. "Why didn't anyone warn us?" Sarah shook her head, her brow furrowed. "Maybe they didn't want to believe it could happen again. Or maybe they hoped it wouldn't. But the fog, it always comes back." Mason let out a low curse. "Great, so we're dealing with some kind of cursed mist?" "It's not just mist," Sarah murmured. "It's more than that. It's alive." Ethan clenched his fists. The journal only confirmed what he had begun to suspect, that the fog wasn't a natural phenomenon. It was something ancient, something connected to the town's past. And Olivia was out there, caught in the middle of it. They continued flipping through the pages of the journal, finding more cryptic entries. References to strange rituals, sacrifices, and shadowy figures that had been seen moving through the fog. It was as if the town had been haunted for generations, cursed by something they had tried to forget. "We need to find out more about these rituals," Sarah said, closing the journal. "There's got to be something here that can help us." Mason glanced out the window. The fog had thickened, swirling like a living thing, pressing closer to the building. "We're running out of time. Whatever's out there, it's coming." Ethan's mind raced. The fog had taken so many already, and now Olivia was trapped somewhere in its depths. He couldn't shake the feeling that the answers they were looking for were tied to the town's abandoned chapel, the one place no one ever went. "I think we need to go to the chapel," Ethan said, his voice firm. "It's the oldest place in town. If the fog is tied to something buried in the past, we'll find it there." Mason frowned. "The chapel? That place has been boarded up for years. Why there?" Ethan met his gaze. "Because it's where the fog seems to be the thickest, and it's where we might find the truth." Reluctantly, Mason nodded. "Fine, but if things go south, we get out of there fast." Together, the three of them made their way toward the edge of town, where the old chapel sat, forgotten and crumbling. As they walked, the fog seemed to press in on them from all sides, growing denser and more malevolent. Ethan could feel it now, the weight of the fog, the way it seemed to pulse with life, watching their every move. The journey was slow, with the thick mist making it nearly impossible to navigate. Strange shapes flickered in the distance, fleeting shadows that danced just beyond their vision. Each time they moved closer, the figures disappeared, leaving nothing but the swirling gray. Ethan's heart pounded as they neared the chapel. It loomed ahead, its weathered steeple barely visible through the mist. The fog was almost impenetrable here, so thick that it was hard to breathe. Suddenly, Sarah froze, pointing to the ground. "Look!" There, tangled in the brush near the entrance to the chapel, was a torn piece of fabric. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. It was Olivia's jacket. His chest tightened with a mixture of relief and dread. She was still alive. She had to be. But how long could she survive in this place? Without a word, they pushed open the creaking doors of the chapel and stepped inside. The fog swirling around them, as if it were alive, waiting for what would come next. Chapter 4. The truth beneath. The chapel's ancient wooden doors groaned as they closed behind them, sealing them in darkness. The air inside was heavy, thick with age and dust, and carried the faint scent of damp stone. The fog swirled around their feet, moving in unnatural patterns, as though it had a will of its own. Ethan's pulse quickened, his thoughts racing. He had no choice but to push forward. Olivia was still out there, somewhere in the heart of this cursed place. The chapel, long abandoned and forgotten by the town, held an oppressive weight. Its stone walls were cracked and crumbling, and the once vibrant stained glass windows were now shattered, leaving gaping holes through which the mist seeped. Yet, despite its decay, Ethan felt as if something was watching them from every shadow, every corner, every inch of the old structure. "We shouldn't be here," Mason muttered, gripping his flashlight tightly. The beam cut through the haze, but barely illuminated more than a few feet in front of them. "This place, it's all wrong." Sarah, her expression tense, nodded toward the altar at the front of the chapel. "We came for answers. There has to be something here. Something that will explain all of this." Ethan swallowed hard, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. He had dragged them into this, into the heart of the town's dark history. And now, it was all coming apart, faster than he could comprehend. They approached the altar, its surface covered in dust and debris. Behind it, a faded mural clung to the wall, barely visible through the grime. Sarah wiped a layer of dirt away, revealing figures in flowing robes, standing in a circle, hands raised toward the sky. Above them, dark clouds swirled ominously. In the center of the mural was a large, ominous figure, shrouded in mist. "Look at this," Sarah whispered, tracing the outline of the mural. "It's like they were summoning something. But what?" Mason narrowed his eyes. "Whatever it was, it didn't work out too well for them, did it?" Ethan stared at the mural, his mind racing. The fog was no accident, no mere weather anomaly. It was connected to something much older, something the townspeople had tried to control, and they had failed. "I need to talk to someone," Ethan said abruptly, his voice cutting through the silence. "There's got to be someone in town who remembers this, someone who was there when it started." Sarah glanced at him. "You think anyone would actually admit to knowing about this?" "Not willingly," Ethan replied, his gaze hardening. "But if the fog is connected to an ancient ritual, then there are people, maybe the older generation, who know more than they're letting on. We need to find them." Mason gave a short, disbelieving laugh. "Good luck getting them to talk. Most of them are probably scared out of their minds." But Ethan wasn't deterred. He knew where to go. The elderly residents of the town were quiet, keeping to themselves, but they had lived through things the younger generation couldn't even imagine. They had seen the town change, and if the fog had been here before, they would know about it. Back in the town, the fog had thickened to the point where navigating the streets was nearly impossible. It wrapped around buildings like a suffocating blanket, obscuring everything in sight. Ethan led Sarah and Mason to the home of Mrs. Callahan, one of the town's oldest residents. She had lived through both world wars and the town's worst tragedies. If anyone knew about the ritual, it was her. The door creaked open after Ethan's persistent knocking, revealing the frail figure of Mrs. Callahan. Her eyes, sharp despite her age, studied them with suspicion, but there was a flicker of recognition when she saw Ethan. "You?" she said, her voice raspy. "I've seen you poking around, asking questions. You don't know what you've stirred up, do you?" Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. "Mrs. Callahan, I need to know what happened. The fog, it's back and people are disappearing. You know something about it, don't you?" She stared at him for a long moment, then stepped aside, allowing them in. The house was dimly lit, the furniture covered in dust. She led them to a small sitting room and lowered herself into a chair, her gaze fixed on Ethan. "You think I don't know what's happening?" she said bitterly. "I've seen it before. Long ago, before the town buried it under lies. The fog, it was never just fog. It was a warning, a curse." Ethan leaned forward, his heart pounding. "What do you mean? A curse from what?" Mrs. Callahan's eyes glistened with something like fear. "There was a ritual. The elders performed it to protect the town from something older than any of us. An entity. A being from the other side. They thought they could control it. They were wrong." Sarah's voice trembled as she spoke. "What happened?" The fog came, Mrs. Callahan said softly. But it wasn't just fog. It was a vessel, a barrier that trapped the souls of the dead. Those who had been wronged, those who had died unjustly, they became part of the mist. It was supposed to keep them at bay, to keep the town safe, but it grew hungry. It fed on the fear, on the pain. Ethan's stomach churned, and now it's back. Mrs. Callahan nodded slowly. The ritual was never meant to be broken, but something has disturbed it, awakened the fog again, and it's worse now, stronger. It wants more than just the town. It wants to consume everything. Ethan's mind raced, piecing together the fragments of what she had said. The fog wasn't just some natural occurrence. It was alive, a living force tied to the souls of those who had died in the town. And now, it was using Olivia as a way to break free. Why Olivia, he asked, his voice tight. Why is it after her? Mrs. Callahan looked at him with a strange, sad expression. Because she's sensitive. She can feel it, hear it. She's a conduit, a bridge between the living and the dead. The fog is using her to break free. If it succeeds, Ethan's heart sank. If the fog broke free, it wouldn't stop at Olivia. It would consume the entire town and beyond. They left Mrs. Callahan's house with a new sense of urgency. Mason, who had remained skeptical throughout, was visibly shaken. His hands trembled as he lit a cigarette, staring at the swirling mist outside. I didn't want to believe any of this, Mason muttered, but I've been seeing things, hearing voices. My brother, who died years ago. It's not just in my head, is it? Ethan shook his head, feeling the weight of the truth settle on him. No, it's not. The fog, it's feeding on us. Our memories, our fears. Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. And Olivia, she's in the middle of it. Ethan clenched his fists. He couldn't let the fog take her. Not after everything. But as they walked back toward the center of town, something began to gnaw at him. Mrs. Callahan had mentioned that the ritual had been disturbed, that something had stirred the fog from its slumber. His mind flashed back to an investigation he had conducted years ago, one that had led him to the town's oldest cemetery. He had uncovered old graves, unmarked and forgotten, with no records of who they belonged to. He had thought it was just a historical anomaly, a curiosity. But what if it had been more than that? What if his actions had reawakened the fog? A sinking feeling filled his chest. Had he been the one to set all of this in motion? Chapter 5. Into the Abyss. The thickening fog was suffocating, and the world outside of it seemed a distant memory. Ethan tightened the straps on his backpack, securing the supplies they had hastily gathered before setting out. His heart pounded in his chest, not from exertion, but from the fear gnawing at the edges of his mind. This was it. There would be no turning back once they stepped deeper into the mist. Sarah stood beside him, her expression a mix of determination and anxiety. She clutched a worn journal they had found in the town's library, her fingers trembling slightly as they gripped the book. The writings inside were disjointed, scrawled by someone clearly teetering on the edge of sanity, but they had pointed to one place, the abandoned chapel. Mason stood a few paces away, staring out into the fog as if trying to spot the thing that lurked just beyond their vision. His face was pale, his usual bravado stripped away by the realization of what they were about to face. He had always been the pragmatic one, the skeptic, but even he could no longer deny the truth of what was happening. "This is madness," Mason muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "We're walking straight into the thing that's been hunting us." Ethan met his gaze. "We don't have a choice. If we don't stop it, it won't just be us. The whole town is at risk, and Olivia, she's still out there." Mason shook his head, rubbing his temples as though trying to shake off the weight of his own thoughts. "You're sure she's still alive? What if it's already too late?" Ethan's jaw clenched. The image of Olivia's torn jacket still haunted him. He had to believe she was alive. He wouldn't let himself think otherwise. Sarah interrupted, her voice firm despite the fear laced in it. "We go in, we figure out what's causing this, and we end it. That's the only plan we've got." They nodded, a silent agreement passing between them. Together, they stepped into the thick wall of fog, heading toward the heart of the town's darkest secret. The fog pressed in on them from all sides, an unnatural cold seeping into their bones. Every step felt heavier, as though the ground beneath them was pulling them down. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional shuffle of their boots against the cracked pavement. It didn't take long for the hallucinations to begin. The first was subtle. Ethan saw a flicker out of the corner of his eye, like a shadow darting between the trees. He turned sharply, but there was nothing there. He shook his head, trying to clear it, but the unease had already settled in. Mason was the next to falter. He stopped suddenly, his breath hitching in his throat. His eyes widened as he stared ahead, his body rigid. "No, it's not real," he muttered, as if trying to convince himself. But the terror in his voice betrayed him. Ethan followed Mason's gaze and felt his stomach drop. There, standing in the fog, was a figure. It was blurry, distorted by the swirling mist, but unmistakably human. As it stepped closer, Ethan's heart lurched. It was a woman, her face pale and expressionless. Her eyes, hollow and dark, seemed to pierce right through them. Mason took a shaky step back, his hands trembling. "Mom?" His voice cracked, barely audible. You're gone." The figure didn't respond. It simply stared at him, unblinking. Ethan grabbed Mason's arm, pulling him back. "It's not her, Mason. It's the fog. It's playing tricks on us." But Mason didn't move. His eyes were glued to the figure, his mind trapped in a memory too painful to escape. "I couldn't save her," he whispered. "I wasn't there when she needed me." The guilt in Mason's voice was palpable, and Ethan knew what was happening. The fog wasn't just showing them visions, it was feeding on their deepest regrets, their worst fears. It was drawing them in slowly, like a predator circling its prey. "Mason, snap out of it!" Sarah shouted, grabbing his other arm. "It's not real, you know that. This is what it wants. Don't let it win." Mason blinked, the spell breaking for just a moment. The figure in the fog flickered like a mirage before vanishing completely. He stumbled back, breathing hard, his face pale and drawn. "I'm sorry," Mason muttered, shaking his head. I couldn't." "Don't," Ethan said firmly. "It's not your fault. It's the fog. That's how it works. It digs into your mind, makes you doubt yourself, but we can't let it take control." Sarah nodded, her eyes scanning their surroundings. "We keep moving. No more distractions." But as they pressed forward, the fog only grew thicker, heavier, like a suffocating blanket that wrapped itself around them, and the hallucinations became more frequent, more intense. Ethan started seeing figures in the mist, familiar faces from his past. His father, standing on the porch of their old house, his face lined with disappointment. His mother, sitting at the kitchen table, her hands folded neatly in front of her, her eyes filled with sadness. They were memories he had tried to bury, but now they were here, alive and vivid, pulling him back into the past. "You never came back," his father's voice echoed through the fog. "You left us behind. You abandoned your family." Ethan clenched his fists, forcing himself to keep walking. "It's not real," he whispered to himself. "It's not real." But the voice persisted, growing louder, more insistent. "You could have saved us. You could have made things right." He stumbled, nearly losing his balance as the weight of the guilt threatened to crush him. But then he felt a hand on his arm, steadying him. "Sarah." "You're stronger than this," she said, her voice firm. "Don't let it take you." Ethan nodded, though his chest felt tight. The fog was relentless, twisting their fears into weapons. But he couldn't afford to lose focus. Not now, not when they were so close. They finally reached the chapel, its dark silhouette looming ahead of them, barely visible through the thick fog. The air here was colder, sharper, like a knife pressing against their skin. The walls of the old chapel seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, as though the building itself was alive. Ethan stopped, his heart pounding in his ears. "This is it," he said quietly. "This is where it all began." Sarah glanced at him, her face pale but determined. "And this is where it ends." They approached the entrance, the massive wooden doors standing ominously before them. Ethan pushed them open, the ancient hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the chapel was dark and still, but the fog hung heavy in the air, swirling around the altar like a living entity. And there, standing in the center of the room, was Olivia. She was motionless, her eyes wide and unseeing, as though trapped in some kind of trance. The fog coiled around her like a serpent, its tendrils brushing against her skin, almost lovingly. "Olivia!" Ethan shouted, rushing toward her. But as he reached out to grab her, she vanished, dissolving into the mist as if she had never been there at all. Ethan froze, his hands still outstretched, his mind reeling. She had been right there, so close. But now she was gone, swallowed by the fog once again. The chapel's silence was deafening, and the weight of what they were up against crashed down on Ethan like a tidal wave. They had come so far, but the fog was still one step ahead, playing with them, toying with their emotions, feeding on their fear. And now, as the darkness closed in around them, Ethan realized that the true battle had only just begun. Chapter 6: The Final Sacrifice. Ethan's heart raced as he stood in the chapel, surrounded by the thick, suffocating fog that seemed to pulse with its own dark energy. It was no longer just mist, it was alive, watching, waiting. The air was thick with tension, and Ethan could feel the weight of the entity pressing in on him. It wasn't just a force of nature, it was something far more sinister, something ancient, and now it wanted him. The chapel walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting as if they, too, were part of this living, malevolent force. The fog swirled around him, growing denser, more oppressive, as a voice, low and guttural, whispered through the air. "All this time," the voice said, reverberating in the very air Ethan breathed, "you've been searching for answers, seeking to understand the fog. But the truth has always been within you." Ethan's throat tightened. His mind raced back to the beginning, to the first time he had stepped foot in this cursed town as a young investigator, probing into the town's secrets. Had it been his fault all along? Had his presence, his curiosity, stirred something that should have been left alone? The fog shifted, and from within it, a figure emerged. Dark, amorphous, yet unmistakably powerful. It loomed before him, a manifestation of every wrong, every hidden sin that the town had buried. Its form flickered, constantly changing, as if made of shadows and regret. "You awakened me," the entity whispered. "Your arrival, your meddling, brought the town's darkness back to the surface." Ethan clenched his fists, guilt tearing at him. He had thought he was just doing his job, uncovering truths, bringing closure to the families of the missing. But instead, he had unknowingly unleashed something far worse. "You are the reason the fog returned," the voice continued, each word striking like a hammer. "Now it demands its due. Only through sacrifice can the fog be lifted." The words sent a cold chill down Ethan's spine. Sacrifice. Of course, this ancient force, this entity born of the town's collective guilt and secrets, would only relent if given something in return. And it was clear what it wanted. The fog twisted, and Ethan saw a figure within it, Olivia. She stood, her face pale, her eyes vacant, as if she was caught in a dream she couldn't wake from. The fog wrapped around her like tendrils, keeping her suspended, a puppet in its grip. "Your daughter," the entity whispered, "or your town. A choice must be made." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The entity was offering him an impossible choice: save his daughter, but allow the fog to continue its reign of terror, or sacrifice her, freeing the town, but losing her forever. His mind raced, trying to find a way out, a solution where neither had to suffer. But deep down he knew that wasn't how this worked. The fog thrived on sacrifice. There was no easy answer. "You came here seeking redemption," the voice said, its tone almost mocking. "But redemption requires a price." Ethan stared at Olivia, his heart breaking. She had been caught in this nightmare because of him, because of the choices he had made long ago. He had come to this town thinking he could make things right, but instead, he had only made them worse. "No," Ethan said, his voice shaking. "Not her. Take me instead." The fog seemed to quiver at his words, the entity swirling around him, testing his resolve. "You would give your life to save this place? To atone for your sins?" Ethan swallowed hard. He had no other option. If sacrificing himself was the only way to stop this, then he would do it. He would give everything to save his daughter, to save the town from further devastation. "Yes," he whispered. "I will." The fog seemed to tighten around him, coiling like a serpent ready to strike. But just as Ethan prepared to give himself over, Olivia, still entranced, stepped forward, her voice soft but clear. "No, Dad," she said, her eyes still glazed, but her voice steady. "I'll do it." Ethan's heart stopped. "Olivia, no," he shouted, rushing toward her, but the fog held him back, preventing him from getting close. She was already stepping into the center of the chapel, her body rigid, the fog wrapping around her tighter with each step. "I've seen the truth," Olivia said, her voice eerily calm. "The fog has shown me everything. It's me it wants. I can stop it." "No," Ethan shouted again, his voice breaking. He struggled against the fog's hold, but it was no use. "You don't have to do this." But Olivia wasn't listening. She moved closer to the altar, where the fog coalesced, growing denser, darker, feeding off her willingness to sacrifice herself. Ethan's heart shattered as he watched her, helpless. "Please," Ethan screamed. "Not her! Take me instead." The entity seemed to pause, as if considering his plea, and for a moment, the fog hesitated. Olivia turned, her eyes meeting Ethan's. For the first time, there was clarity in her gaze, a flicker of the girl he had always known. "I love you, Dad," she whispered, "but this is the only way." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. No, it's not," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Tears blurred his vision as he fought against the fog's hold, desperation clawing at him. He couldn't lose her. Not like this. Not after everything. With a strength he didn't know he had, Ethan surged forward, breaking through the fog's grip just as Olivia reached the center. He grabbed her, pulling her back into his arms. "No," he cried, holding her tightly. "I won't let you go. I won't lose you." The fog roared around them, the entity's frustration palpable. It swirled and lashed out, but something had changed. Ethan's love for his daughter, his refusal to let her sacrifice herself, had weakened the entity's power. "You think you can defy me?" the entity hissed, its voice now a cacophony of rage. "You think love will save you?" But Ethan held on to Olivia, his arms wrapped around her protectively. "I won't let you take her," he said, his voice firm. "I won't." The fog writhed, but it was no longer as strong. Ethan's defiance, his willingness to face the truth of his past without sacrificing the one thing he loved most, had drained the entity of its power. The fog, once thick and oppressive, began to thin, dissipating into the air. Ethan could feel it, the fog's grip loosening, its hold on the town slipping away. The darkness that had plagued them for so long was finally lifting. But as the fog receded, Ethan knew there was still one final price to pay. He could feel it in his bones, in the weight of the silence that followed. The town was safe, but his time was running out. He looked down at Olivia, who was finally free from the fog's control, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. "Dad?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan smiled weakly, brushing a hand through her hair. "It's okay," he said softly. "You're safe now." But Olivia's eyes filled with tears. "What about you?" Ethan didn't answer. He couldn't. The fog was gone, but the sacrifice had already been made. As the last wisps of mist faded into the night, Ethan felt a coldness settle over him. His vision blurred and the world around him began to dim. But he didn't care. Olivia was safe. That was all that mattered. When Sarah and Mason arrived at the chapel, they found it empty. The fog was gone, the air clear, but Ethan and Olivia were nowhere to be found. They searched the grounds, calling out their names, but all they heard was the soft rustle of the wind through the trees. The town was quiet, peaceful, as if the fog had never been there at all. But in the distance, faint and barely audible, came the soft echo of Olivia's voice, carried on the breeze like a distant memory. And they knew that while the fog was gone, its shadow would always remain.